On this episode of Skeptiko.
In the article that you wrote, you cited his work and you said that his research delivered a blow to the idea that the mind and the brain could be separate. Do you remember this whole thing?
Yes, of course. And he wrote me and said, I disagree. That is not what my research means. And so we agreed to disagree. But that's how I read it.
How can you agree to disagree? I mean, if you said his methods were wrong or that his conclusions were faulty. But what you did is...
It's not in the methods, it's in the interpretation of what it means.
But that's his research.
I am skeptical of some of the methods of how they interpret experiences that people report having.
Stay with us for Skeptiko.
Today we welcome science historian, best-selling author, and one of the world's best-known skeptics, Dr. Michael Shermer, to Skeptiko. Dr. Shermer is here to talk about his new book, which is quickly climbing the bestseller list on Amazon and elsewhere. The title of that book, The Moral Arc, How Science and Reason Lead Humanity Towards Truth, Justice, and Freedom. Dr. Shermer, it's great to have you on. Thanks so much for joining me on Skeptiko.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate that.
So this issue, that being morality, has been a hot topic and somewhat of a touchy topic among atheist, skeptical communities that you are a big part of. Why is it that that has been such a hot topic and such a touchy topic? And what really, I guess the question is, what led you to write this book about morality?
Sure. Well, it's touchy in American culture because we're such a religious nation that the idea that morals and moral values and moral progress can come from some source other than religion strikes most people as either crazy or insulting. Not just wrong, but like really evil, an evil idea. And but in fact, as I show in the book. Answer the second part of your question. The book is something of an extension of all my previous books, which are pro-reason, pro-science, trying to show how science and reason are the best tools we have for understanding the world. And that includes the moral world, the moral sciences, as David Hume used to call them. The idea that ever since the Enlightenment, philosophers then, all the way up to scientists today, tried to pattern themselves after the luminaries of the scientific revolution who discovered that the world is governed by natural laws that can be understood through reason and empiricism, through this new tool called science. And it turned out that it really works. I mean, Newton showed that you could describe both celestial and terrestrial mechanics using, the same set of equations, and that the entire universe is governed by natural law. And it was shortly after that all the great philosophers in the Enlightenment that who were familiar with, they self-consciously modeled themselves after these scientists, saying the social world, the moral world, the political world, the economic world, these are also governed by natural laws, and we can understand them and try to make the world a better place by understanding them.
I think you're right, and I think you make a very strong case in the book for why that seemingly disconnect between morality and science and reason maybe shouldn't be such a disconnect or shouldn't catch us by surprise. As a history of science buff, researcher, scholar, really, you do a great job of connecting these shifts in moral behavior that many of us have experienced through our lifetime, more reduction in sexism or the way we treat people who are gay or lesbian or have a different lifestyle. And I think what you do, and you do a real nice job of this in the book, is show how these kinds of shifts can't really be traced back to religious breakthroughs. It's not like somebody discovered some scroll in some cave and then said, gee, we should stop enslaving people. But it really was through science and reason, wasn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Although I should point out that, the Mormon Church had a new revelation from God that that polygamy was a bad idea after all, right around the time that Utah wanted to become a state in the union and the federal government said polygamy is illegal. And then they also had another revelation from God that African Americans are not as bad as they thought they were, right when their sort of racist doctrines collided with the civil rights movement in the 1960s and 70s. In 1978, God passed down a new ordinance saying, actually African Americans are okay. So, but normally what religious people do is they just inculcate the expanding moral sphere that everybody else, the rising tide, kind of brings along to everybody. And then they cherry pick passages in the Bible that sound more inclusive. So they'll cite something like Moses saying that, you should be nice to Egyptians because you were once strangers in a strange land like they are here. But of course that's tucked away amongst dozens of stories of rape and pillage and destruction and murder and mayhem that Moses himself ordered his own people to, perpetrate upon others. And or they'll talk about Jesus being more expansive and more liberal and nicer, and that's true. He's better than the Old Testament gods, but that those passages are themselves tucked away amongst passages that are anything but in the modern liberal tradition. So it really does come from the invention of rights in the 17th and 18th centuries. You can track it even in modern moral crusaders like Dr. Martin Luther King. He himself says his primary influence was Gandhi, who was anything but a Christian, and the most liberal of theologians. And so they and the arguments they used for abolition of slavery were rights language kind of arguments. They weren't really quoting scripture because scripture makes it pretty clear slavery is kind of cool and it's good as long as you take care of them. And the passages in the Old Testament about slavery are really quite gruesome. If like one of them was that I found kind of forgotten about was that if you you can free one of your slaves after 7 years, but if you marry them first and then they have kids and a spouse, the kids and spouse are not allowed to go free. So setting one member of the family free is hardly, a liberal thing to do, a moral thing to do when they'd have to leave their family. And who's going to do that? So really all the arguments for the abolition of slavery and all the other rights revolutions, all the way up to the modern ones we're going through right now, are really infused with rights language from the 18th century.
So well said, and you do a nice job in the book of exploring several examples of where that's come up, and I think slavery is one of the most dramatic ones. I'm comfortable with where you're at there in saying that religion and scripture is off the table in terms of a source for morality. I'm a little bit less sure, and I got to wonder about, I guess so many of the great scientists have told us, some of the people you reference in the book, Newton, Tesla, Edison, others that you reference in the book, claim that they were connected to some kind of extended consciousness. So maybe this wasn't exactly from the Bible, but they felt like they were tapping into something more, something beyond themselves.
Sure, that may be, but I don't really care about that, or I don't even care if they were themselves religious. That the sources of their ideas were not religion, even if they're religious, it doesn't matter. The idea that, like, Newton was very religious. He wrote more about, scripture and the proper interpretation of the book of Daniel and so forth than he did, on physics.
Well, he wrote more about alchemy than he wrote about Christianity.
Yeah, exactly. So, none of that matters. What matters is the principles that turned out to be true, verifiable by other people, and they really work. And that includes the ideas of like John Locke and Immanuel Kant and Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Paine, Thomas Hobbes, all those great Enlightenment philosophers. We would call them scientists today. That word wasn't invented back then. They were natural philosophers. But the idea was, it doesn't matter. I don't care how religious they are. Thomas Hobbes made his big argument in favor of the monarchy, that none of us would embrace today. But his idea that the universe is knowable and natural laws govern societies, and we should discover what those are. That's what has changed the world.
Right, but when these same people, so you take Martin Luther King, who you referenced, or in the book you referenced, that really we associate that term, the moral arc, with Martin Luther King, but you trace it back even further to theologian and abolitionist Theodore Parker, both those guys are saying, hey, there is something more that I'm tapping into. It's not just reason. It's not just logic. There's something more. Do we have to take those claims into consideration?
Well, historically, they're interesting, I guess. A lot of Dr. King's language was very metaphorical. His speeches were so brilliant, so good, because he'd wax very poetic using these biblical tropes and religious phrases and sayings from songs and previous speeches and things like that. He was so good at that. But again, none of that really matters. What matters is, what's the arguments that were made to persuade people to change their minds about African Americans and civil rights. That's what we care about. And that's what we're identify. It's, the actual rights language, that people should be treated equally under the law. Where does that come from? Or that no person should be a means to an end, but are ends in of themselves. That's Immanuel Kant.
Okay, but where does that come from? I guess in the book you make the case and trace it back to evolution and the behavior of social primates. I mean, that's ultimately where you come down on in terms of where it comes from, right?
Oh, I do, yes. I say that my moral starting point is the survival and flourishing of sentient beings, individual sentient beings, not groups, not races, not genders, not nations and states and collectives of any kind, but the individual. The whole Bill of Rights is designed to protect individuals from being discriminated against as a member of a group. That it doesn't matter what religion you are, race, creed, color, whatever, you're an individual, and by virtue of being human, you have these natural rights. So I'm definitely a natural rights person, not a utilitarian, because like with the trolley problem, the trolley's hurling down the track is going to kill the 5 workers unless you flip the switch and it sends it down the other track and it kills the 1 worker. Would you kill the 1 to save the 5? Almost everybody says they would. It makes sense. It's a utilitarian calculus. But in fact, this is a problem because, first of all, how does the 1 person feel about it? And being sacrificed. And second of all, it's too easy to ratchet up there from, kill 1 to save 5 to kill 10 million to save 50 million. And pretty soon you have yourself a genocide. We really need to kill these 10 million Jews in Europe to save the pure race of the Aryans or whatever. It's too easy. We're too easily swayed by bad ideas, by pseudoscience, by nonsense. This whole race and blood and eugenics and all this stuff or witch burning. We have to burn these witches to save our community from plagues and bad weather. These are just bad ideas that science debunks. And so the progress comes from reason and science, primarily.
I'm with you on all that. We're disconnecting on one point. I have an interview coming up with renowned theoretical physicist Dr. Lawrence Krauss. I know you know him. And I was just watching the movie he did with Richard Dawkins, and you make a brief appearance in that film, The Unbelievers. And so here is the state of science, if you will, with Dr. Krauss saying in a very matter-of-fact way that the universe is meaningless, therefore our lives are meaningless, except for any illusionary meaning we might attach to them with this thing we called consciousness, which is really just a product of our brain. I just think you're kind of making a little bit of sleight of hand if you accept this meaningless universe, meaningless lives thing, but then try and roll it back into social behavior of primates. I mean, those primates are still in a meaningless world doing meaningless things if that's where you sit. How do you get morality in there? I don't quite get that fit.
Uh-huh. Well, certainly Lawrence is correct that the universe itself is meaningless. There's nothing outside of it saying, you, dear universe, have meaning. This is it. But within it, the meaning of a star, its reason for being is to convert hydrogen into helium and so forth, the other elements when it dies. That's its purpose. That's its meaning. That's what nature designed it to do by dint of the laws of nature. That's what gravity does under high pressure. By the same principle of natural laws, evolution designed us to want to survive, to give us a life instinct, to want to breathe, to want to eat, to want to procreate, to want to, if you're a social species, to want to socialize with other members of your species. And all the things that we find meaningful as a social primate species. That's what evolution designed us to do. I mean, I shouldn't use that word design. That's what natural selection created in the process of this. And this all goes back to Dawkins' thought experiment at the beginning of The Selfish Gene. Imagine you're a molecule. What would you do to survive? And so you have to create a survival machine, an organism to carry your genes into the future generations. Well, these organisms have to be motivated to do certain things like eat, procreate, flourish, find food, find mates, and so forth. So they have to have these emotions that drive them to do things. Well, they also have to have moral emotions, because the difference, as Richard points out, between kicking a rock and kicking another survival machine is that this other survival machine will kick you back. It doesn't want to be exploited. So we have these emotions of standing up for ourselves, fighting back, feeling anger and vengeful about being cheated or being aggressed against, and so on. So all of that comes out of our biological nature just by dint of being human, or even broader than that, a sentient being of some kind, a social primate species, a mammal, whatever, however far you want to expand that sphere. Gives you that drive. It comes with the territory no less than a star burning hydrogen into helium by the laws of gravity.
Well, maybe. I mean, let's put a big maybe on all that. I think for most people, there's a huge leap between saying meaningless universe, consciousness is an illusion, we're all basically biological robots, which is what Dawkins says, to there's a moral arc that we're moving towards, and we're making things good and better because of our drive to survive. I mean, I think there's a major disconnect there for most people, especially when we connect them but with people like Martin Luther King and other folks who clearly believe that their impulse is driven by something outside of them, something more that I think connects a lot of people. Now, as you point out, it connects them probably incorrectly with some kind of religious traditions that we can point at and say have some problems. But I'm sure you hear this a lot, that people aren't quite in sync with how we can bridge those two worlds between the atheistic kind of reductionistic science world and this spiritual but not religious world.
Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, what I predict will happen with the gay rights revolution, same-sex marriage revolution, is what's happened with all of them. That is to say, religions will get on board. They already are. Episcopalians already were, and now, slowly but surely, the Baptists and Presbyterians and others are getting on the wagon, the moral wagon here. And in 5 to 10 years, they will all say, you know what? God loves everybody, including gays. What were those people thinking back then? Well, you were one of those people thinking back then. Not you, Alex, the religious person making this claim. And so they somehow changed their mind. And how does that happen? Well, because of this bending moral arc, by the fact that all of us collectively slowly change our minds, slowly expand the moral horizon to include more and more people, more and more sentient beings who are not immediate members of our immediate kin and kind and family and in-group. The in-group just keeps getting bigger and bigger. Women, minorities, now gays, now animals, the animal rights, I have a whole chapter on animal rights. So, but on one level, I don't care how they got there, as long as they get there. Technically, historically, I like to point out, it wasn't really religion that abolished slavery. It was the rights revolution that did it from the Enlightenment. But anyway, as long as they're on board with it, I'm happy about that. That's good. But let me just back up to the previous point. So in the book, I make an analogy with public health. The whole for 2 centuries we've been creating sewers and sanitation systems and flush toilets, and we've been studying diseases and plagues and tracking how they move, all with a goal and end to for more people to survive and flourish in our societies, for fewer people to die of smallpox and measles and so on. And the current anti-vaccination movement has everybody wringing their hands because this could be bad news. People could die from these bad ideas. Okay, if you agree that saving hundreds of millions of lives who used to die from smallpox and measles and so on and no longer do, if you agree that's a good thing, why is it a good thing? Why you, Alex? I'm asking you. Why would you agree that that's a good thing?
I'm not sure. Why would I mean, do I agree or why would I agree?
Yeah, well, okay, first, do you agree that that's a good thing to save hundreds of millions of lives?
Sure.
Yeah, okay, why?
But see, I have a different sensibility in terms of why I think that's so. So,
well, I'd just be curious to hear it.
I think that there is a moral imperative that drives me, whether I'm totally conscious of it or not. And I think what you were referring to, I would see as some kind of collective consciousness that does exist, even if I can't totally describe it or pin it down in a lot of ways. So,
oh, you mean like in a Deepak kind of way, that there's a consciousness is pervasive in the cosmos?
Maybe in a Carl Jung or a
really? Okay.
Well, Rupert Sheldrake, Cambridge biologist.
Oh, wow.
Morphic
Okay.
resonance.
All right. All right. Well, yeah, we'll have to agree to disagree on that one because I don't accept the existence of a cosmic consciousness. But okay. Well, I could be wrong.
Tell you what, let me tell you this, because last week we scheduled this interview. You're very generous to do it. I know you've done a lot of interviews for this book. I sent out the announcement to Skeptiko listeners. The number one question I got back to ask you, and I think it's relevant to this latest bit of conversation we were just having, and they said, ask him about the piece he wrote in Scientific America, March 2003, in which you cited a paper from Dr. Pin von Lommel, a near-death experience researcher who published, we should say, in one of the top medical journals in the world in 2001 in The Lancet. In the article that you wrote, you cited his work and you said that his research delivered a blow to the idea that the mind and the brain could be separate. Do you remember this whole thing?
Yes, of course. And he wrote me and said, I disagree. That is not what my research means. And so we agreed to disagree. But that's how I read it.
How can you agree to disagree? I mean, if you said his methods were wrong or that his conclusions were faulty. But what you did is...
It's not in the methods, it's in the interpretation of what it means.
But that's his research.
I am skeptical of some of the methods of how they interpret experiences that people report having, because there is a little gray area there. There is a little fuzziness or subjectivity in how those reports are interpreted. That part, it's not that he's wrong. It's so much as that, there's different ways to interpret what those experiences actually mean.
Right. Maybe inside of that. But I think this gets at the issue that I think a lot of people have with the skeptical atheist community is that after a while, it kind of feels like there's this pattern of, disinformation, misinformation, because when a guy reports the research, you can either say, I disagree with the research or I disagree with the methods, but you can't say, oh, what that research says is this.
Yes, you can. Of course you can. The whole point of the discussion section at the end of a paper, that's where the sort of boldness of the researcher and the counter arguments of the critics, that's where all the action is. That's where it comes, is how do you interpret the data? What kind of model are you using? So, for example, Oliver Sacks wrote, he's written several critical pieces of that very research, that and other pieces of research, saying, no, it does not mean what these guys think it means. I think it means the following. And he makes the case that if you read any of his books, the experiences that these people have are clearly tied to neurochemical imbalances and damages to the brain, strokes and tumors, stuff like that. And that if you knock out a part of the brain, the temporal lobe, the function part that was there is gone. Well, where'd it go? I mean, like with a split brain patient, there should be now two sources of consciousness, not one. Does that mean there's two conscious brains somewhere floating around in the ether somewhere? I mean,
Well, I don't think we know what it means, but I think what's happened since the von Lommel paper, and I don't want to focus on that. I appreciate your position on it, but there's just been a continuation of research published, near-death experience research, one after another. These guys aren't lined up. They don't have some big agenda to kind of push something. They're just producing research. The latest was a 10-year study by Sam Parnia, formerly of Cornell, and a group of researchers in the UK came to the exact same conclusion. There isn't a single near-death experience researcher that's come to a different conclusion. But it's not just near-death experience research, you know. I mean, right there, you're in Los Angeles. You can drive right up the street to UCLA, and you can go visit UCLA School of Medicine psychiatrist Dr. Jeffrey Schwartz. Same stuff, you know, coming out and saying that this idea that the mind is a product of the brain doesn't fit. We have to look for more. It opens up the door to the kind of extended consciousness that I think so many people that do have this religious inclination or spiritual inclination, because I don't want to say religious. I'm not a backer of religion, but I think people are much more open to the idea that there is a reality to that moral compass inside them that does come from something other than their mere biology. And I just don't think that's where the book, I guess, rings true in terms of encompassing in that larger body of work.
Okay, so take something like gay rights and same-sex marriage now. So we're in the middle of this revolution, and we can track how the changes happen. And we can see it in the polls, the Pew polls, Gallup polls, how people slowly change their mind. And we can track how it happens when, like with the coming out campaign, for example, celebrities, authors, politicians, scientists, CEOs like Tim Cook coming out. This changes how people think about gays. Instead of thinking of gays as something other, something less than human or different, so different they don't deserve the same rights, or that they have these, this gay agenda that they want to impose on the rest of us. And, the more that people know somebody who's gay, the less they think those bad ideas. And that happens from the bottom up through television, pop culture, books, novels, films, newspaper articles. It just sort of cascades along. You don't need a majority to get started. You just need a handful of influential people to first stand up and say, we're not going to take this kind of discrimination anymore. And then, we want the same rights as you. And then, look, tons of people that are like this, and they're normal people. And before you know it, the whole thing changes. And I don't think there's anything, whatever word you want to use, mystical or having to do with consciousness, other than, all of us change our minds, over the course of a few years to a few decades. And before you know it, the shift has been made. And I think you can track all that through sociology, psychology, anthropology, political science. I don't think you need, say, consciousness research for that, other than how brains change their mind.
Well, I don't know if you do or not, I guess. I mean, I think you make a very strong point for the fact that we can't trace that to any particular set of beliefs that are enshrined in some kind of religious mystery or anything like that. I'm with you there. But I think at the end of the day, we have to be open to all the possibilities of what that could mean. And when you say, well, we wouldn't trace it to some mystical consciousness, that begs the big question of what is consciousness. And I think when we don't tackle that question, we don't wrestle it to the ground, we're left open with the same kind of disconnect of saying, well, it's somehow a feature of biological primates, and yet we're still saying they have some kind of conscious experience that we can't explain. We don't understand where it starts, where it ends, or any of the rest of that. Maybe you don't see that as a big problem to the moral question, I take it.
I don't. I don't think we need that as an explanatory vector in our model of how things change morally. Mm-hmm. I mean, I don't discount it. I guess I just don't even really think about it. I mean, it's just not in my worldview. My worldview is, I'm a monist. I'm a naturalist. I don't think there's anything supernatural or whatever you'd want to call it. But on that, let me just make one final point on that. Let's say that turned out to be true. The near-death experiences really do represent, a connection to some other world, and we were able to figure out where that is and how the connection is made through quantum physics, say, and neuroscience, and maybe the idea that there's these microtubules inside neurons where the collapse of the wave function happens, and there's a quantum effect there, and we can connect with each other. That would no longer be part of the supernatural or paranormal. It would just be part of physics and neuroscience. It would just be incorporated into science if it turns out to be true. So it really wouldn't change my worldview. It would just be one more causal vector to include in our equation, so to speak, of why things happen in the world as they do. And if it turned out that the universe really is bending, in a moral arc, for some reason other than what I document in the moral arc, that's fine. I don't care. I mean, it's all still part of the natural world as far as I'm concerned. As long as science can measure it in some quantifiable way, we can, test it. There it is. See it. You can measure it. Like quantum effects can be measured. If that was indeed the case, then that would just be part of the natural world. Would you agree?
Well, unless consciousness is in some way fundamental.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Yeah, I see what you mean.
Which is a viable alternative way to interpret even some of the quantum effects that we're talking about, right? So the little double slit experiment, is a wave, is it a particle? It depends on the observer. I'm not saying that there's a direct link there, but that hints at in some way, and many researchers as well as philosophers have suggested that maybe in some way consciousness is fundamental. A lot of folks in the atheist community are into kind of a very secular version of Buddhism and meditation. Sam Harris, of course, is. I mean, the basic thought philosophy behind that is purely that consciousness is fundamental, consciousness is the source, and that the matter that we're measuring as scientists is kind of looking in the wrong end of the telescope because it originates with consciousness.
Yeah. So for your listeners, I should point out that most neuroscientists do not agree with that. You can find some. You cited UCLA and a few other places. Yes, okay, that's fine. But Christoph Koch, at the Allen Institute, formerly at Caltech, Sam Harris does not agree with Deepak in that argument that consciousness is fundamental property of the universe. He does not think that, even though he, where he goes with his own theories on consciousness and meditation and spirituality are quite different than most atheists. He's still not in that camp. He's not in the, say, Deepak Chopra camp. He definitely disagrees with that. So, and so that kind of brings us back to, where you start with a worldview. If you start that consciousness is fundamental to the universe, you're going to end up somewhere different than if you start off with saying consciousness is a product just of brains.
Right. Or you can just start with the data and just try and sift through the data and see where it falls. And
I'm not sure you can do that. I'm not sure that the data indicate for sure one way or the other, although I make the case in another column in Scientific American that I think I call it Aunt Millie's mind, because I asked Deepak one time at one of his conferences, where does Aunt Millie's mind go when her brain dies of Alzheimer's? We know that, the neurons die, one by one, and as they go, her mind goes, her memory goes, her personality shrinks and disappears, and pretty soon she's just gone. Well, where did it go? I mean, if it exists separate from brains, why is it tied to the brain neuron by neuron, and where is it? Now, Deepak's answer was, well, Aunt Millie's mind returned to where it began, to the cosmic consciousness, or I forget the phrasing he used, but it was something like what you're talking about. Well, how would you test that? You can assert it. You can make an assertion. That's where it goes. But how do we know?
Well, I think, first of all, you obviously have a very broad understanding of this, and you've thought a lot about it, which I think is fantastic. And I appreciate you entertaining these thoughts. And I don't want to carry this on too far because we want to talk about your book, which is an excellent book, The Moral Arc. People should really check it out. It does a great job of, like we say, kind of retracing this history and putting it in a different context that for me was new and very eye-opening. But just to make a small point on that last thing of Aunt Mellie or whatever her mind is, I mean, you might look at the research into terminal lucidity. If you go into any extended life or end-of-life care facility and you talk to the nurses and the doctors there, you'll find people that regularly report folks who have been in long-term coma, have severe dementia, and near the final moments of their life will sit up in bed and demonstrate unexplainable lucidity, and they'll sit and talk to the people about important events, about important things, and then they'll die. So
Yes, there are stories like that, but most people who die slowly in cases like this, my mother was one. They don't do that.
Correct.
So
They
the question is, why do some do and some don't?
Well, now we're talking science, aren't we? Now we're talking we need a man on the moon effort to answer that question. So maybe we'll get there someday.
Okay, sounds good. But see, in terms of the moral arc, I'll give you some more examples of this that, like Robert Wright's book, Non-Zero, which is really quite a good book. He hints just a little bit at the end that perhaps this whole thing, this, playing more zero-sum, non-zero-sum games versus zero-sum games, that is this tendency toward cooperation slightly more than competitiveness, maybe edges out over the course of time, maybe was built into the universe from the very beginning. And so he kind of makes the argument that, had it not been humans, it might have been Neanderthals doing what we're doing now. And if not Neanderthals, maybe Homo erectus, not Homo erectus. He goes all the way back, eventually chimps and gorillas would be doing what we're doing now. So that's pushing that sort of inevitability to the arrow of moral progress more than I'm comfortable with. I'm willing to actually say the whole thing could go down the toilet. If Putin decides to unleash his, nuclear arsenal, we're back in the Stone Age. I don't think that's going to happen, but, I don't think it's inevitable.
I'm open to the fact that could happen. The one other thing I'd throw in, we're mentioning the UCLA and Jeffrey Schwartz. What Schwartz showed is, he's a researcher and he was interested in helping people who had obsessive compulsive disorder. What he found, and I'm sure you've run across this in your science research, is this idea of self-directed neuroplasticity. So 20 years ago, we didn't know that brains could rewire themselves, that neuroplasticity was even possible. Well, now what he's shown in the laboratory, also replicated at Harvard and at Yale, is that folks with their own attention, with their own directed thoughts, can rewire their brain.
Yeah, but I'm familiar with the research. Why is that not just neurons firing, influencing other neurons all within a brain? It's just still brain.
You have to look at Dr. Schwartz's work, because what he says quite convincingly, I think, if you go down your path, Michael, you have a chicken and the egg problem, right? I mean, if thoughts make brains and brains make thoughts, then you wind it back. And how did it all start? So this is like a primary cause problem in the evolutionary equation, right? Because now we have the idea that thoughts can actually change things.
Yeah, what are thoughts? It's just neurons firing.
Well, I think it begs that question of what are thoughts, and are thoughts strictly viable in the materialistic reductionistic model? Dr. Schwartz doesn't think they are, but then that's just, as you said, that's just one guy out there.
That's right. And Sam, I'll cite Sam again because he's not too far removed from Jeffrey Schwartz.
He's there. He's there. He just doesn't realize it.
Well, I'll let Sam speak for himself on that front. But what my point is that I think Sam would agree meditation, and self-awareness and all these things are really good for health, for, well-being, for rewiring your brain to do all sorts of things. But without any of the, the sort of, I don't know which words to use. I don't want to say woo-woo, but just, the sort of supernatural element. It's still just neurons firing. It's just different neurons influencing other neurons, and round and round in a loop they go. And you can will that to happen by, some other parts of your brain where the will is located. So I don't know that we need to invoke anything more than that.
Dr. Shermer, you have an excellent trailer for the book up on YouTube that people can check out. What else are you doing out there? Is there any movie projects or anything associated with this?
Oh, yes. Yeah. No, I'm working on having a film made of the moral arc.
Thanks again to Dr. Shermer for joining me today on Skeptiko. I have one question to tee up from this interview. I could actually have a long, long list of questions, including one about Dr. Shermer's casual dismissal of all experiences that might ever be discovered that are paranormal as being incorporated into our natural worldview once we have a way of measuring and explaining them. Boy, talk about the promissory note of materialism. and the idea that we should have faith that Dr. Shermer's science as we know it will figure everything out if we just give him enough time. But I'm not going to focus on that question or any of my other ones because I want to focus on one question, kind of a big, complicated question to tee up from this interview, and it centers around this very troubling situation with the article he wrote in Scientific America. The article was titled Demon Haunted Brain, and it was published in the March 2003 issue of Scientific America. And in it, Dr. Shermer reported on this research by renowned near-death experience researcher Dr. Pim van Lommel, who is a cardiologist in the Netherlands who studied this phenomena extensively for many, many years with a number of patients across a number of hospitals and came to the conclusion that a conventional explanation for near-death experiences was not possible. To this, Dr. Shermer wrote his article and said that van Lommel's research delivered a blow to the idea that mind and brain could be separate. Now, the question is, do you think this crosses the line in terms of science journalism, or do you think, as Dr. Shermer positioned it in this interview, that it's just the discussion session, it's just his analysis of it? I have to jump in here and offer up my opinion because I think it goes way over the line. It would be like me saying that Dr. Shermer's book, The Moral Arc, delivers a blow against the idea that religion hasn't played a role in defining our moral character as a country because he cites religious leaders like Dr. Martin Luther King as being influential in defining our morals. Well, of course, it's true. He does cite Dr. Martin Luther King, but his conclusion is, of course, exactly the opposite. It's that Dr. King's religiosity isn't what's important, and instead it's his ideas, thinking, reason, logic that's important. Well, the question is, do I have an obligation to point out that even though I'm using evidence from his book, the opinion I'm drawing is exactly the opposite? Well, this is analogous to the situation in 2003 with Dr. van Lommel. Dr. van Lommel's conclusion, after all of his research, after compiling all this data and presenting this data in a peer-reviewed journal, was the opposite of what Dr. Shermer reported on. So I think there's some room for maybe some disagreement on this. I mean, a reporter does have a right to analyze and offer opinions, but I do think there's a certain obligation to make it clear when their opinions vary that sharply from the findings of scientific research, particularly in this case where you have a peer-reviewed, very tightly presented bit of research. So I think it's noteworthy. I think it's noteworthy that he still can't back down from that. He can't see any problem with that. And in spite of the fact that scores of research has been published since then corroborating exactly what Dr. van Lommel concluded, he's still holding to this position. But we might even ask the larger question, and I think this is the gaping hole in the atheist, skeptical view of the world, is why the heck does Shermer care so much about near-death experience anyway? His strongest points are his points against religious orthodoxy and fundamentalism. He's somehow, as has atheism in general and skeptics in general, created this strange brew of science and religion that has evolved into their own crazy creed that no one could really take seriously. After all, who really believes they're a biological robot leading a meaningless life in a meaningless universe? Michael, only the most desperate church haters can swallow that stuff. Oops, there I go. After my olive branch offering at the beginning of this episode towards the atheists and their valid points about religious orthodoxy, I'm kind of pulling that olive branch back and beating them over the head with it a little bit. But in this case, I think it's warranted. What do you think? Tell me. Of course, the place to do it is through the Skeptiko website at skeptiko.com. You can leave a comment there. Jump over to the forum where I like to hang out and hear your great ideas. Or connect with me on Facebook or Twitter, or just send me an old-fashioned email. So I have a number of interesting shows coming up, appearances coming up as well. I'm going to keep pounding away at this atheist question some more. I think there's many, many angles to it that I want to explore, and I think it is so central to many of the issues that we really care about here. So I'm eager and excited to do it, and I hope you will enjoy it as much as I enjoy bringing it to you. Well, then that's going to do it for today. I hope you've enjoyed this. Do take care, and bye for now.